For millennia, human beings across cultures and civilizations have operated under a deeply rooted assumption that within each person lies a stable, enduring, and immutable self. This self is often described as the soul, Atman, or spirit, an inner essence that persists through change, survives death, and serves as the foundation of identity and moral agency. From Plato's immortal soul to the Hindu Atman and the Abrahamic concept of an eternal spirit judged after death, this view has been the norm in both religious and philosophical thought. This idea is not simply cultural, it is existential. People feel intuitively that there is an unchanging I who experiences the world, who thinks, remembers, suffers, desires, and acts. Language reflects this deeply embedded belief. I am thinking, I remember my past, I will continue to exist. The idea of annihilation, a total cessation of self, is terrifying because it threatens this very core assumption. However, in stark contrast to this view stands an ancient, radical teaching from the early Buddhist texts in the Pali Canon. There is no eternal, unchanging self. And perhaps even more provocatively, the mind, or consciousness, is not a soul, it is a process. In Western traditions, especially those influenced by dualistic metaphysics, consciousness is often seen as something non-physical that inhabits the body, much like a ghost in a machine. This consciousness is associated with personal identity, volition, and inner life. In this framework, death is the separation of this soul from the body, and salvation or liberation is the destiny of this soul after bodily life. In many New Age and modern spiritual circles, this idea has simply been rebranded. Terms like higher self, true essence, or soul consciousness still presume some core identity, a metaphysical observer that watches experience and endures through time. Even in popular secular psychology, consciousness is sometimes viewed as a continuous stream, an experiencer that perceives all mental and emotional states. But the early Pali texts present something far more nuanced, and for many, unsettling. In the Nikayas, the oldest strata of Buddhist scriptures preserved in the Pali language, consciousness is not described as a stable entity or a core self. Instead, it is a conditioned phenomenon. It arises due to causes and ceases when those causes end. It is not a thing in itself, but part of a dynamic system that includes mental formations, perceptions, feelings, and the body. The Buddha teaches that what we conventionally call a person is merely the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates arise and pass away every moment. None of them constitute a self or soul. This view is not a metaphysical claim about non-existence, nor is it nihilism. It is a phenomenological observation. When we observe directly how experience functions, there is no discoverable owner of the experience, only a flux of conditioned events. As the Buddha states in the Anattā Sutta, consciousness is not self. If consciousness were self, it would not lead to affliction. But since consciousness is impermanent, subject to change, and not self, it leads to affliction. This turns the common notion of mind or soul on its head. The mind is not who we are. It is simply what is happening. Understanding consciousness not as a soul but as a process has profound implications psychologically, ethically, and spiritually. Psychologically, it allows for disidentification with thought and emotion. One is not one's anger, fear, or sorrow. These states arise, stay for a while, and pass away. Ethically, it opens space for responsibility and growth. If there is no fixed self, there is no fixed character. Change is possible. Spiritually, it points to liberation. Freedom is not the perfection of a soul, but the cessation of clinging to anything as I or mine. This insight is central to the path of insight meditation, where practitioners examine the arising and passing of mental states to see their impermanence, their unsatisfactoriness, and their lack of self. Yet, despite its centrality in Buddhist thought, this idea is often misunderstood, even by those who practice meditation or study Buddhism. Many import the soul concept into Buddhist frameworks, treating Vaya as a hidden self or eternal awareness. This is a subtle form of clinging that the Buddha explicitly warned against. This essay seeks to explore and clarify the nature of consciousness as presented in the Pali Canon, not as a soul, but as a process dependent on conditions. Through careful examination of canonical texts, analysis of dependent origination, In Reflection on Meditative Insight, we aim to answer fundamental questions. What is consciousness? According to the Buddha, how does consciousness arise and cease? Why is it not a soul or self? What happens to consciousness at death? What does it mean to live without a fixed self? We will walk through both doctrinal and experiential dimensions, referencing key suttas, Abhidhamma insights, and contemporary interpretations. In doing so, we will see that understanding the mind as a process rather than a self is not merely a theoretical exercise. It is a gateway to profound inner freedom. The Pali term for consciousness is vaya, derived from 6 and a with makrane. Thus, vaya literally means differentiated knowing or discernment. In the suttas, vaya is not an abstract metaphysical substance but a functional awareness of sense data, arising dependent on a specific contact between the sense organ and its object. The Buddha defines vaya as follows in the Mātāssakya Sutta. Consciousness is named after the condition through which it arises. Eye consciousness arises dependent on the eye and forms. Ear consciousness arises dependent on the ear and sounds. There are 6 kinds of consciousness, each corresponding to a sense base. Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. Each arises in dependence on a specific sense organ, its corresponding object and contact. None exist independently. When the causes are present, consciousness arises. When they cease, so does consciousness. This is an extremely conditional and dynamic understanding, not of a fixed perceiver, but of fleeting acts of knowing. In the early Buddhist model of experience, all phenomena constituting a person are grouped into the 5 khandhas. Rupa, physical form; Vedana, feeling; Sana, perception; Sakara, mental formations; Vaya, consciousness. The aggregates are not selves, nor do they contain any self. The Buddha repeats throughout the suttas that all 5 are anicca, dukkha, and anattā. Consciousness, though subtle and foundational to experience, is not exempt from this rule. In the Anattā Sutta, the Buddha says, "Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Bhante. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, Bhante. Is it fitting to regard what is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change as this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Bhante. Hence, consciousness is not a background observer, not a soul, not an unchanging presence, but part of the dynamic interplay of the aggregates. Nowhere is the conditioned nature of consciousness more clearly illustrated than in the doctrine of dependent origination, one of the Buddha's most profound insights. This 12-link chain shows how suffering arises due to interdependent causes. The key section is, with name and form as condition, consciousness arises. With consciousness as condition, name and form arises. Here, Namarupa refers to mental and physical phenomena, and Vaya refers to consciousness. This is a reciprocal relationship. Mind, body, and consciousness sustain each other. This circular causality shatters the illusion that consciousness is the origin of experience. It has no independent ground. It doesn't enter the body or inhabit form. Instead, consciousness arises in dependence on conditions and contributes to the arising of further conditions. In the Mahānādana Sutta, the Buddha elaborates, "Were consciousness not to descend into the mother's womb, would name and form take shape? No, Lord. If consciousness were to depart, would name and form remain? No, Lord. Therefore, consciousness is involved in this body from its beginning. Yet, this does not imply a soul entering the body. It emphasizes that life arises through conditions, not due to a single metaphysical self." A key insight of early Buddhism is that consciousness is always about something, a particular object. There is no such thing as objectless, pure, eternal awareness in the Pali teachings. In fact, the nature of consciousness changes depending on its object and context. From the Sayatana Sutta, where there is the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises, their meeting is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. There is no consciousness in general. Only specific consciousness is based on sense objects. This rules out a notion of Vaya as some kind of eternal background witness, as seen in many non-Buddhist spiritual philosophies. If the eye is damaged or the visual field removed, eye consciousness ceases. The same holds for all 6 kinds. Thus, consciousness is contingent, momentary, and dependent. Perhaps most revealing is how the Buddha responded to questions about the fate of the enlightened person after death. When asked whether a Tathagata exists after death, does not exist, both, or neither, he refused to answer. Why? Because such questions assume a fixed self or consciousness that continues or doesn't. In the Aggregates Sutta, the Buddha uses the metaphor of a fire. Suppose a fire were to go out, having consumed its fuel. Would you say that the fire has gone to the east, west, north, or south? No, Bhante. So too, the Tathagata has gone out. But it is inappropriate to say that he has reappeared, has not reappeared, both, or neither. Here, consciousness is like a flame. Its existence depends on fuel. Without fuel, there is no fire. Not because it goes somewhere, but because it ceases. Likewise, when the conditions for consciousness cease, there is no more rebirth, not a soul that moves on, but a process that ends. To understand why the Buddha denied the existence of an eternal self and redefined mind as a process, we must explore the 5 aggregates. These are the components of what we conventionally call a person. They form the entirety of what we experience as body and mind, and are always in flux. Instead of positing a permanent soul, the Buddha describes the individual as a collection of constantly changing phenomena, which together give the illusion of unity and continuity. These are Rupa, physical form; Vedana, feeling; Sana, perception; Sakra, mental formations or volitional constructions; Vaya, consciousness. Each aggregate arises and passes away according to conditions. None of them can be identified as a self or soul. Instead, what we call a person is merely the momentary coordination of these 5 aggregates. This concept, repeated across many suttas, is central to the Buddha's teaching on non-self. If even consciousness is not self, then what could possibly be the I? Let's unpack how each aggregate functions in a moment of daily experience. Suppose someone hears a bird chirping. Rupa, the ear, the bird's sound, and the air vibration. Vedana, a pleasant or neutral sensation arises with the sound. Sana, the mind identifies it as a bird chirp. Sakra, a mental reaction arises, perhaps fondness or memory. Vaya, your consciousness arises based on the ear, sound, and contact. This moment of experience involves no fixed observer, only conditioned phenomena. The self is not hearing, the process is hearing. And the mind, rather than being a constant experiencer, is simply one piece of this process. If each moment of consciousness arises and ceases, why do we feel like the same person across time? Why does the mind seem so continuous? The answer lies in the rapid succession of mental events and the power of memory. As each moment arises conditioned on the previous, consciousness is renewed continuously, like frames in a movie. The flow is so fast and seamless that it gives rise to the illusion of stability. The Visuddhimagga, a classical Theravada commentary, explains this using the simile of a lamp. A flame appears constant, but is in fact a rapid succession of burning. So too with consciousness. This is not to deny that consciousness exists, it does, but only as a stream, not a fixed being. The Buddha calls this the Vyasoda, the stream of consciousness, not to be confused with modern psychological terms, but as a dynamic, conditionally arisen series of cognitions. While the aggregates explain the structural composition of a person, mind, particularly sana and sakra, play a powerful role in shaping perception and generating craving and suffering. In the Sayatana Vagga, the Buddha shows how perception and mental constructions color every experience. For example, the same sound may be heard as pleasant or irritating depending on one's mood. The mind overlays meaning, value, and emotion onto raw sensory data. This layering process conditions future experiences. When not seen clearly, it gives rise to attachment to feelings. I want more of this pleasure. Identification with thought. This thought is mine. Belief in self. I am the thinker, the feeler, the knower. But under close meditative investigation, each of these layers can be seen as impersonal processes, not entities. The I is not found. A central misconception is to treat Vaya as separate from or superior to the other aggregates, as a kind of observer. However, in the Pali Canon, the aggregates are mutually conditioning, not hierarchically arranged. Consciousness depends on form, perception, formations, and feelings just as they depend on it. In the Manasakya Suttas, the Buddha rebukes the view that consciousness can wander from body to body on its own. He says, "Were a man to say, apart from form, feeling, perception, and formations, I will make known the coming and going of consciousness," he would be speaking empty words. This means consciousness has no existence apart from the other aggregates. It is co-arising. There is no pure observer standing outside experience. The aggregates are not the problem. The problem is clinging to them as I or mine. This clinging is the fuel that keeps the wheel of rebirth spinning. The Buddha outlines 5 kinds of clinging to the aggregates: clinging to form, clinging to feeling, clinging to perception, clinging to formations, clinging to consciousness. Each type involves identifying with a process and believing it is me. But when one investigates deeply, one sees that none of these can be controlled, owned, or preserved. They change moment to moment. This insight leads to detachment, disenchantment, and eventually cessation, the ending of suffering. One of the Buddha's most profound and revolutionary insights is the principle of dependent origination, which forms the core of his understanding of existence. This principle states, "When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases." This formula applies universally, but most famously it explains the origin and cessation of suffering through a 12-link causal chain, the 12 nidanas. At the heart of this chain lies Vaya, showing that even the mind is a product of causes and conditions, not a fixed or eternal substance. Here is the classic sequence of the 12 links. Avijja, ignorance. Sakra, volitional formations. Vaya, consciousness. Namarupa, name and form. Sayatana, 6 sense bases. Phassa, contact. Vedana, feeling. Ta, craving. Upadana, clinging. Bhava, becoming. Jati, birth. Jarmara, aging and death. Each link arises dependent on the previous one. The appearance of consciousness is specifically tied to sakra, the volitional formations created by ignorance. Thus, with ignorance as condition, volitional formations come to be. With volitional formations as condition, consciousness arises. Consciousness is therefore not a starting point, but a middle point, a result of prior causes and itself a cause for future effects. One of the most fascinating dynamics in dependent origination is the mutual conditioning between Vaya and Namarupa, the Sutta state. With name and form as condition, consciousness comes to be. With consciousness as condition, name and form comes to be. This circularity illustrates the interdependence of body and mind and consciousness. Consciousness cannot arise without mental and physical processes, and those processes do not manifest without consciousness. This is not a contradiction, but a reciprocal feedback loop that maintains the continuity of experience across lifetimes. It provides a model of rebirth without a soul, as long as the conditions are present. The processes regenerate, just like a flame lighting a new candle. This stands in stark contrast to the idea of a fixed self or eternal awareness. Instead of a soul moving from body to body, what continues is a causal continuity of conditions that produce new consciousness moment by moment. Some thinkers have attempted to interpret Vaya as the source or driver of the whole chain, as if consciousness were the secret soul behind the show. But this contradicts the Buddha's own explanations. In MN 38, the Buddha explicitly rejects the idea that consciousness is the cause of mentality and materiality. He says, "Were a man to say, apart from form, feeling, perception, and formations, I will make known the coming and going of consciousness," he would be speaking empty words. This means that consciousness cannot be understood apart from the rest of the aggregates. It is not a permanent core of identity. It is simply a conditioned event, arising due to other conditions. The Buddha's teaching on rebirth without a self may appear paradoxical at first. How can rebirth occur if there is no soul to transmigrate? The answer lies in the logic of dependent origination. Rebirth occurs not because a soul travels, but because causal conditions recreate experience. Just as one flame lights another, just as one thought conditions the next, so too craving, clinging, and volitional formations condition the arising of new consciousness. The continuity is causal, not substantial. In SN 12.38, the Buddha says, "It is craving, monks, which conditions the coming of consciousness into a new mother's womb. Where there is craving, there is movement. Where there is movement, there is rebirth. Hence, Consciousness arises wherever there is a fuel for its arising, namely, craving and volition. This view avoids both eternalism and nihilism. It offers a middle way of causal continuity. Dependent origination works both forward and in reverse. When the 12 links are allowed to unfold, they generate dukkha. But when ignorance ceases, the entire chain begins to dismantle. Here's the reverse process. With ignorance ceasing, volitional formations cease. With volitional formations ceasing, consciousness ceases. With consciousness ceasing, name and form ceases, ending with the cessation of birth, aging, and death. The ultimate goal of the Buddhist path is thus the cessation of all conditions that give rise to consciousness. This is nibbana, the unconditioned, where the process no longer continues. The Buddha calls this the unborn, the unaging, the unailing, the deathless, the cessation of becoming. It is not annihilation of a self, but the ending of a process, the cooling of the fire, the blowing out of craving and mental construction. In Pali Buddhism, consciousness is not permanent. It arises and ceases depending on conditions. So when the Buddha speaks of the cessation of Vaya, he is pointing to a profound state in which the entire mental process has been brought to an end. But what does it mean for consciousness to cease? Does it imply oblivion, annihilation, or non-existence? No. It simply means that the process of arising and ceasing, conditioned by ignorance and craving, no longer continues. This is neither nihilism nor eternalism, but the middle way the Buddha taught, a path beyond the dual extremes of being and non-being. The cessation of consciousness refers not to the destruction of a self, but to the ending of the impersonal stream of experience that has been fueled by craving, volitional formations, and ignorance. This is the ultimate freedom nibbana. The word nibbana literally means blowing out or quenching, like extinguishing a flame. The Buddha often used the fire simile to describe both the burning nature of life and the peaceful cooling of its end. The world is on fire, monks. What is it that is burning? The eye is burning, forms are burning, eye consciousness is burning with the fire of lust, hatred, and delusion. Adhitapariyaya Sutta, SN 35. 28. To be caught in conditioned existence is to be burning, in a cycle of rebirth, suffering, and craving. When that flame finds no more fuel, it goes out. Not because it has been destroyed, but because the conditions for its burning no longer exist. Thus, the cessation of consciousness in this context means that the stream of rebirth-bound consciousness ends. This is nibbana. Before final nibbana, the arahant, an awakened one, still experiences consciousness. But their consciousness is purified, no longer driven by craving, ignorance, or clinging. The Paṭicca Sutta offers a famous expression of the awakened mind. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, only the heard. In the sensed, only the sensed. In the cognized, only the cognized. Then, Paṭicca, you will not be with that. When you are not with that, you are not in that. When you are not in that, then you are neither here nor there nor between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. This teaching reflects the radical simplicity of the liberated mind. It experiences reality without distortion, without attaching I or mind to any process. The aggregates still function, but they are seen clearly as not self. Thus, even though Vaya still arises, it does not bind. It does not lead to becoming. It leaves no trace. This is one of the most asked and most misunderstood questions in Buddhist philosophy. The Buddha was repeatedly asked, what happens to the Tathagata after death? Does he exist? Not exist? Both? Neither? To all of these, the Buddha remained silent. In the Aggregates Sutta, he uses the metaphor of a fire. When a fire burns dependent on fuel and goes out, where does it go? The answer, it does not go anywhere. It has simply ceased. Similarly, when the causes for the aggregates and consciousness have ceased in the arahant at death, there is no self to go anywhere, and no process to continue. The flame is out. The Buddha describes this as anupadasisa nibbana, final nibbana without residue. The early texts make clear that nibbana is not a blank void or nihilistic emptiness. It is described using positive metaphors: the unborn, the unconditioned, the deathless, the island beyond, peace, freedom, liberation, the supreme goal. But these are not descriptions of a metaphysical place or thing. They are pointers to a state free from clinging and suffering. Nibbana is not a thing the mind enters. It is the ending of all thing-making processes, the cessation of fabrication. The fading of ignorance, the end of becoming. One of the more intriguing suttas is Khandha Sutta, in which the Buddha describes, "There is that sphere where there is no earth, no water, no fire, no air, no this world, no other world, no sun, no moon. There, I say, there is neither coming nor going, neither standing nor perishing. It is the end of suffering." This has sometimes been interpreted as referring to a type of pure, objectless consciousness. But in context, the Buddha says this is not a state of perception at all, not even infinite space or infinite consciousness. The term Viññāṇa in DN 11 has been debated, but most Theravada commentators do not interpret it as an eternal consciousness. Instead, it is a poetic reference to nibbana, where even the flow of consciousness has ceased. The point remains. In nibbana, nothing is grasped, nothing is clung to, and therefore no consciousness arises. The Buddha was not a metaphysician, he was a physician of suffering. His teachings on the impermanence and conditioned nature of consciousness serve not to generate abstract theory but to guide practice. The Eightfold Path is the way to reach the ending of the process. Right view, understanding dependent origination and non-self. Right intention, renunciation, goodwill. Harmlessness, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, observing mind and body with detachment, right concentration, cultivating deep states of samadhi. In vipassanā meditation, one observes the arising and ceasing of mental events directly. When seen clearly, the illusion of a self within consciousness dissolves. One sees only process, only change. The deeper this insight, the less fuel remains for the fire of becoming. The closer one comes to coolness, nibbana. In the spiritual traditions that surrounded the Buddha's time, the idea of a permanent self or soul was almost universally accepted. The Upanishadic teachings, in particular, claimed that within all beings existed an eternal, unchanging essence, Atman, which either was identical to or part of Brahman, the ultimate reality. Against this backdrop, the Buddha's teaching was radically countercultural. He repeatedly rejected the idea of any permanent, unchanging, essential self. In the Anattā Sutta, the Buddha teaches the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, volitions, and consciousness, and asks, is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Bhante, is what is impermanent. Suffering or happiness? Suffering, Bhante. Is it fitting to regard what is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change as, this is mine, this I am, this is myself? No, Bhante. The conclusion is clear. Consciousness, like all other phenomena, is not self. Therefore, no self or soul can be found in any of the components of experience. This is not a speculative denial, but a direct observation of conditioned phenomena through insight. The Buddha encourages investigation, not belief. The Buddha's rejection of a self is not merely a denial of metaphysics, it's part of his deeper strategy of avoiding the two extreme views. Eternalism, the belief that the self or soul is eternal and survives death unchanged. Annihilationism, the belief that the self ends completely at death and there is nothing beyond. Both are rooted in wrong view and lead to suffering. In the Aggregates Sutta, the Buddha says, this world is supported by existence and non-existence. But for one who sees the origin of the world as it actually is with right wisdom, there is no idea of non-existence regarding the world. And for one who sees the cessation of the world, there is no idea of existence regarding the world. This subtle middle way is dependent origination, the understanding that all phenomena arise and cease due to causes and conditions, without any need for a metaphysical self or soul. If there's no self, what about consciousness? Isn't that the real me? This question arises naturally, and the Buddha was well aware of it. In the Paṭicca Sutta and other places, he teaches how to observe experience without superimposing a self onto it. The sense of I am is a deep-seated conceit, not a reality. In the Paṭicca Sutta, the Buddha makes it clear. Consciousness, friend, arises dependent on a condition. It does not arise without cause. Were consciousness to remain, clinging to it would not result in suffering. But because it arises and ceases, it is suffering and not fit to be regarded as self. The attempt to identify consciousness as the self is seen as another form of grasping, ultimately bound to produce dukkha. The illusion of selfhood is a cognitive distortion built upon momentary experiences and impressions. When these are examined closely, through the practice of insight, no core can be found. Some seekers wanted to press the Buddha into metaphysical commitments. They asked questions like, is the world eternal or not? Does the Tathagata exist after death? Is the soul the same as the body or different? In the Kamalankiya Sutta, the Buddha famously refuses to answer these. Suppose a man is struck by an arrow and says, I will not allow the arrow to be removed until I know who shot it, of what caste, what kind of bow. He would die before learning the answers. The point is that speculative views do not lead to liberation. They distract from the one truly urgent matter, the ending of suffering. The Buddha insists that his Dhamma is not a metaphysical system, but a path, a practical method of uprooting the causes of suffering. Rebirth in Buddhism is not the movement of a self or soul from one body to another. Instead, it is a process of causal continuity, much like a flame lighting another flame. In Milindapanha, a later Pali text, King Milinda asks Nagasena, is there a person who transmigrates from one body to the next? Nagasena replies, no, great king, but there is rebirth through causes. Like milk turning into curd, curd into butter, butter into ghee. Though one comes from the other, they are not the same. This shows that what continues is not a being, but a process. The sense of identity is maintained through memory, tendencies, and craving, not through a self-entity. The belief in a self across lives is an illusion born of ignorance. Eternalism, believing in a permanent self, might seem comforting, but in the Buddha's view, it leads to subtle forms of bondage. It feeds conceit. It supports clinging to identity, body, views. It undermines insight into impermanence. It distorts ethical motivation, e.g., seeking eternal reward. The Buddha viewed such beliefs as obstacles to liberation. In the Brahmajala Sutta, he lists 62 wrong views, most of which center around speculations about the self and the cosmos. Rejecting these, he offers a practical alternative, seeing things as they are, anicca, dukkha, and anattā. The realization of not-self is not merely intellectual, it is transformative. The Buddha says, so long as a monk does not understand as they really are the origin and passing away, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in regard to the 5 aggregates, he regards them as self. But when he sees clearly, all clinging is abandoned. That, monks, is the destruction of the taints, the liberation of mind. This insight brings about nibbana, the cooling of the fire, the freedom from cycles of becoming. Thus, liberation is achieved not by clinging to a soul, but by seeing clearly that there is none, only ever-changing, empty processes. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the Buddha's teaching is its emphasis on direct experience. The Dhamma is not a matter of belief or dogma, it is a path of investigation, to be known and verified through personal insight. In the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha tells the Kalamas not to accept teachings based on tradition, scriptures, logic alone, teachers' reputations. Instead, he advises, when you know for yourselves, these things are unwholesome, blameworthy, lead to harm, then abandon them. This emphasis on knowing for oneself is the key to the Buddhist path, and it is through meditation, particularly insight meditation, that one comes to directly observe the nature of consciousness, not as a soul, but as a conditioned, impermanent process. The Satipatthana Sutta outlines the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind states, mindfulness of mental objects. It is in Citta Vipassana, the observation of mind, that practitioners are encouraged to notice the mind with lust, without lust, the mind with hatred, without hatred, the contracted mind, the distracted mind, the concentrated mind. This practice is not about identifying with these states, but simply observing their arising and passing. In doing so, one begins to see that mind is not a unitary thing, nor a self, but a series of momentary conditions that appear and disappear like waves in an ocean. The word citta in Pali is used in multiple ways. In meditation, it refers to the immediate mental quality or state, not as a container or soul, but as an ever-changing experience. In the Abhidhamma and later commentaries, this is broken down into citta moments, each arising with specific conditions and quickly ceasing. Modern mindfulness practices inspired by vipassana often focus on this dynamic. noticing how each moment of thought, sensation, emotion, or perception arises and falls away. This aligns perfectly with the early Sutta teaching of Anicca and Anattā. For instance, in SN 12.61, the Buddha says, just as when there is rain and water flows down a slope, it gathers and rushes on. So too, consciousness arises dependent on name and form, and it is not standing still, but moving onward. Through meditation, one sees there is no thinker behind the thought, no controller behind the emotion, just a flow of events conditioned by past actions and present causes. Paṭicca Samuppāda, or dependent origination, is not just a doctrine, it is a meditative insight. When one observes the mind carefully, the entire chain becomes visible. Contact arises when there is sense base, sense object, and attention. From contact arises feeling. From feeling arises craving. From craving arises clinging. From clinging arises becoming. From becoming arises birth of new identity. From that birth arises aging and death, and thus dukkha. But meditation reverses this. With the cessation of craving, clinging ceases. With the cessation of clinging, becoming ceases. Seeing this in real time allows one to step off the wheel. It is this radical clarity of cause and effect that brings freedom. As one continues in mindfulness, a powerful insight arises. The mind is not mine. A thought arises without warning and ceases. An emotion appears, burns brightly, and vanishes. A perception changes in an instant. Who is it that owns these things? The meditator begins to see clearly. There is no one behind experience. In the Viññāṇa Sutta, the Buddha gives a condensed but profound teaching. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, only the heard. If you see this, there will be no you in terms of that. This teaching is a direct method for realizing anattā, the non-identification with experience. Rather than I am seeing or I am thinking, one simply notices seeing, thinking, feeling events without ownership. This breaks the illusion of a permanent self residing in the mind. While mindfulness is central, the Buddha also emphasized samadhi, or meditative concentration, as a means to stabilize the mind for insight. In the jhana states, the mind becomes deeply absorbed, quiet, unified. When emerging from these, one can observe with great clarity the impermanence and constructed nature of all mental phenomena. The progress of insight in Theravada meditation often moves through stages. Seeing mind and body as distinct, understanding cause and effect, observing impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self, disenchantment and letting go, knowledge of cessation, equanimity toward all formations, realization of nibbana. These stages unfold through direct contact with the arising and passing of consciousness. What is the end result of this practice? The mind no longer identifies with its content. Thoughts are no longer mine, emotions are no longer me, perceptions no longer form a false identity. Instead, the practitioner experiences radical freedom. As the Sabbasava Sutta teaches, by seeing things as they truly are, one abandons the taints through insight, through mindfulness, through direct knowledge. This is the lived realization that consciousness is a stream, not a soul, and that liberation lies not in controlling or perfecting the mind, but in letting go of ownership over it. Despite the Buddha's radical and clear rejection of a permanent self, the notion of an enduring soul or inner essence continues to dominate many religious, philosophical, and even psychological frameworks, both in the East and West. From Christianity's belief in an immortal soul to the Upanishadic Atman. From Descartes' thinking self to contemporary ideas of a true self in popular psychology, the default human view seems to gravitate toward the belief that there is something in me that is me. Why? Because the illusion of a self is not primarily intellectual, but experiential. As long as the body feels mine, the thoughts appear to be my voice. And emotions arise with a deep sense of I feel. The false sense of ownership over experience persists. This is what the Pali texts call asmamana, the conceit, I am. Thus, the soul belief is not rooted in logic but in ignorance, not knowing how the mind works. Even within Buddhist communities, the concept of anattā is often misunderstood or misrepresented. Some interpret it negatively as nihilism. There is nothing, or we are nothing. This distorts the teaching and aligns more with Akita Daihi, which the Buddha strongly rejected. Others unconsciously import soul-like ideas into rebirth, imagining that something subtle must be transferred between lives, reinventing the soul in new terms. There are even some schools of thought, such as in certain Mahayana developments, where store consciousness or Buddha nature has sometimes been reified into a kind of permanent substratum, which the early Pali texts clearly warn against. The Pali Canon consistently opposes these ideas. The Buddha says, "This Dhamma is for the abandoning of all views, not for the taking up of new ones. It leads to dispassion, not grasping." The point is not to replace the soul with another, deeper truth, but to see that the illusion of a self is built upon impermanent, conditioned phenomena, and thus, it must be let go entirely. Human beings fear impermanence, uncertainty, and especially death. The soul idea offers psychological comfort. It promises continuity, a way to survive after death. It promises justice, rewards or punishments beyond this life. It gives a sense of uniqueness and control. I am special. I choose my path. By contrast, the Buddha's teaching seems stark. No enduring me, no eternal observer, no metaphysical consolation. But this is not pessimism. It is freedom from delusion. The Pali texts compare the desire for a self to clinging to burning coals. They may feel familiar or warm, but they burn us every time with suffering, confusion, and rebirth. To give up the soul idea is not to fall into meaninglessness. It is to discover a deeper peace, one not built on illusion. In modern secular societies, even without religion, the idea of a true self continues. We are told to find ourselves, be authentic, or follow our true nature. Therapy and self-help often speak of an inner child, core identity, or unchanging inner truth. While these may serve helpful psychological functions, from a Dhamma perspective, they risk reifying a process into a personality or a self, subtly reinforcing the idea of something fixed and enduring. The Buddha offers a different approach. To see even identity, trauma, memory, personality, and narrative as impermanent, conditioned, and not self. The Buddha advises not to grasp even the 5 aggregates as self. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. By letting go of identification, the mind opens to greater flexibility, resilience, and peace. One of the greatest supports for the illusion of a self is language itself. We say, I see, I think, I feel. We speak of my body, my mind, my past. But in the Pali texts, the Buddha encourages careful observation of experience as it is, without inserting a doer or owner. In the Vipassanā, he teaches, in the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, only the heard. Then, Viññāṇa, there is no you in that. This practice of deconstructing experience helps free us from linguistic habits that support delusion. Modern neuroscience has also begun to challenge the idea of a central self, noting that the brain constructs the sense of I from many subsystems. This aligns well with the Buddha's insights too. 500 years ago, of all the aggregates, consciousness is the most tempting to mistake for a self. It is continuous, subtle, mysterious, and feels like the knower. But, as we have seen in previous parts, the Buddha is very clear. Consciousness is impermanent, dependently arisen, and not self. He says, Bhikkhus, if anyone were to say, consciousness is self, that would not be fitting. Since consciousness arises and ceases, is it proper to regard it as self? The mistake comes from misperceiving continuity. Because one moment of consciousness conditions the next, and memories persist, it feels like something stable is observing. But with deep meditation, as in vipassanā, one begins to see clearly. Each moment of awareness arises freshly, conditioned by the previous ones, but no single, enduring thing continues. There is continuity without identity. The Buddha's teaching of anattā is not merely a metaphysical claim, it is a radical shift in how we relate to the world. It removes the center point from experience. No I behind seeing. No self owning the body, no controller in charge of thought. Just causes and conditions, arising and ceasing, experience without owner. This perspective can feel destabilizing at first. It threatens ego, pride, control, narrative, but it also unlocks profound freedom. As the Dhammapada says, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. At the heart of the Buddha's path lies a transformative promise that by seeing clearly and deeply the nature of reality, specifically the impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self-nature of all things, one becomes free. Not merely intellectually, not philosophically, but in an existential, irreversible way. This freedom is nibbana, the unconditioned, the end of suffering, the cessation of clinging and becoming. And it comes not through acquiring anything, but through relinquishing, especially the delusion of a self. In the Fire Sermon, the Buddha declares, "All is burning, burning with the fire of lust, the fire of hatred, the fire of delusion." He names the 6 sense bases, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind as burning because of attachment. But when a practitioner sees clearly, this burning stops. How? When we no longer see the eye as my eye, there is no more craving to preserve it. When we no longer see thoughts as my thoughts, we stop fueling the emotional dramas they trigger. When we no longer see consciousness as me, the whole edifice of becoming collapses. This is why anattā is the final key to nibbana. It undermines the last refuge of clinging, the sense that this is mine, this is what I am, this is myself. When that illusion falls away, the fires go out. In fact, the very word nibbana means extinguishing, as in the extinguishing of a flame. Nibbana is often misunderstood, especially when interpreted through the lens of soul-based religions or materialist views. It is not annihilation of a self, a place where one goes, merging with a universal soul, eternal unconsciousness. Rather, in Pali texts, nibbana is described as the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion, the unconditioned, the end of becoming, the deathless. The Buddha says, "There is, monks, that which is unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not that, there would be no escape from the born, become, made, fabricated." Thus, nibbana is not a thing attained by a self. It is the realization that there never was a self. And hence, there is no more to cling to, no more becoming. In many suttas, the final realization of liberation is marked by 3 insights: knowledge of past lives, knowledge of the arising and passing of beings according to their karma, knowledge of the destruction of the taints. But what seals the realization is always the third: the ending of ignorance, the uprooting of craving, and the clear seeing of not self. An arahant is not someone who has gained a perfect version of a self. Rather, they are one who has completely seen through the illusion. When asked whether a Buddha exists after death, the Buddha remains silent, not out of confusion, but because the question presumes what has already been abandoned, a self to be located. As he says, "Because form is impermanent, feeling, perception, formations, consciousness is impermanent." Seeing this, the well-instructed noble disciple becomes disenchanted, and through disenchantment, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is liberated. A common question arises: does an arahant still have consciousness? Yes and no. While alive, an arahant still experiences the 5 aggregates, including consciousness, but they no longer cling to them as self. There is no craving toward the experience, no identification with the mental content, no movement toward rebirth. The stream of experience continues, but the illusion of I within it has vanished. And at death, when the body disintegrates and there is no longer any support for consciousness to arise again, that process ceases. This is not annihilation, because there was no fixed entity to begin with. The process simply stops. The Buddha says, just as a fire burns dependent on fuel, when the fuel is gone, the fire is said to be extinguished. One of the striking aspects of early Pali teachings is the Buddha's refusal to define nibbana in positive metaphysical terms. When asked, is the Tathagata after death, or does he exist, or not, the Buddha remains silent. Why? Because language is conditioned, and all concepts rely on dualities, existence/non-existence, this/that, subject/object. But nibbana is unconditioned. It cannot be captured in conceptual thought. The Buddha says, there is that sphere where there is no earth, no water, no fire, no wind. Not this world, nor another world, neither sun nor moon. There, I say, is no coming, no going, no standing. It is the end of suffering. This is not a place, but a reality beyond becoming, what remains when the fires of clinging are extinguished. While nibbana may be described in lofty terms, its practical fruit is visible here and now. The arahant lives with complete peace, unshaken by gain or loss, praise or blame. They do not fear death, nor long for rebirth. They act with compassion, wisdom, and equanimity, but without identification. It says, the arahant has no clinging for past or future or present, with nothing to grasp. They are free. This freedom is not philosophical, it is existential clarity that transforms every moment of life. Understanding that there is no soul, no abiding me, and no controller behind our thoughts may seem, at first, like a purely philosophical or meditative insight. But for the Buddha, it is deeply practical. The realization of not-self is not meant to stay in the meditation hall or the philosophical text. It is meant to penetrate and reshape the way we live, moment to moment. However, for many, this poses a challenge. How can I make decisions without a self? What happens to love, ethics, creativity, or responsibility? If there is no me, who suffers? Who meditates? These are natural questions, and they arise because the habits of selfing are so deeply ingrained that imagining life without them feels threatening. But as the Buddha and many arahants showed, it is possible to live fully, freely, and ethically without a self. Let us now explore how the view of not-self is integrated into daily life. The mind does not need a self to make decisions. It needs causes and conditions, attention, and clarity. In the Pali Canon, there is no suggestion that the absence of a soul leaves a person passive or paralyzed. Instead, the Buddha emphasizes wise volition, mindfulness, and discernment as the basis for action. Example: when hungry, you eat, not because a soul decides to, but because a conditioned process seeks nourishment. When you see someone in pain, compassion arises not because your core identity is good, but because empathy is part of the human process when not clouded by delusion. Thus, choice and morality don't need a self. They need clarity, training, and understanding of conditions. A common concern is that without a self, morality collapses. But in the Buddha's teaching, it is precisely because things arise by conditions that actions have consequences. Karma works without a soul, just like planting a seed brings fruit without a self in the seed. This view strengthens ethics. If there is no unchanging core, then we are always shaping what we become. Every action matters, not for a self to own it, but for the world it creates in this life and beyond. Since I and you are both conditioned, transient processes, the distinction between us softens, compassion arises more easily. In fact, the precepts and the Noble Eightfold Path function as a framework for cultivating a wholesome stream of mind, not for the sake of myself, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. Often, we think we must possess others to love them, my partner, my child, my friend. But clinging brings suffering, and clinging is rooted in the illusion of ownership, which stems from a false self. The Buddha taught a different kind of love, metta and karu, a universal care that arises from understanding. This being, like me, suffers. This mind stream, like mine, is impermanent, fragile, and seeking peace. There is no real boundary between us, only patterns of form, feeling, perception, and habit. When we understand this, we can love fully. Without control, we can care without fear of loss, because there is no one to lose or keep, just a flow of experience to cherish while it lasts. Perhaps the most powerful transformation from understanding not-self is in how we face death. If we believe in an eternal self, death is terrifying. It threatens the annihilation of me. But if we understand that there never was a permanent self, then death is simply the ceasing of a process, the dissolution of conditions. About the arahant, for him who has no attachment, who clings to nothing. Even this body, when it breaks, is no longer his. Just as a cart's axle breaks when the wheel is worn, so too does the life end without sorrow or fear. To live without a soul is to die without terror, because there is no one who truly dies. Can we still be ambitious, creative, or inspired if we know the self is an illusion? Absolutely, but the motivation changes. Instead of striving to prove myself, be someone, or leave a legacy, one might instead work to relieve suffering. Create as an expression of joy or insight. Act to support the Dhamma and benefit beings. The activity continues, but the grasping stops. The burden of ego drops. We no longer need to defend, compare, or inflate myself. The Buddha was supremely active, teaching, walking, guiding for 45 years, yet utterly empty of self-reference. That is the example. To live without a soul doesn't mean denying experience. It means observing it wisely. In practice, this means seeing a thought arise. There is thinking, not I am thinking. Feeling anger. There is anger, not I am angry. Noticing craving. This is desire, not I want this. This subtle shift, replacing identification with observation, is at the core of Satipatthana. As the Buddha says, he abides contemplating the body as body, feelings as feelings, mind as mind, phenomena as phenomena. Internally, externally, both. Clearly seeing with insight. Free from clinging and distress regarding the world. This way of living brings calm, clarity, and compassion. Ultimately, not self is not something to believe in. It is something to see directly. Again and again, until the illusion fades. Intellectual understanding is only the beginning. The real fruit comes from continuous observation of the aggregates, deepening insight and meditation, letting go of grasping in daily life. In time, the experience of I am may arise less frequently, less rigidly, and finally fall away altogether. Then, as in the final verse of the Dhammapada, he whose victory cannot be undone, whose conquest no one in the world can follow. By what path will you lead that trackless one, the awakened one, free of craving? To live without a soul is not to live without meaning. It is to live with profound immediacy, humility, and interconnectedness. When the burden of me drops, the present moment becomes luminous, not filtered by ego. Others' joy becomes your joy, since the boundary softens. Suffering becomes something to respond to, not something to defend against. And gradually, the mind becomes what the Buddha called an island unto itself, a refuge with no other. Not a fortress of ego, but a peaceful stream, flowing without resistance, guided by wisdom. The Buddha's teaching on consciousness as a process, not a soul, invites us into a radically different way of being. One where there is nothing to defend, nothing to possess, nothing to fear losing, yet also nothing lacking. To understand this deeply is not to become cold or detached, but to become fully alive, responsive, and free. As we close this exploration, when there is the view, I am, there is clinging to identity. When one sees, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, the mind becomes dispassionate, and through dispassion, it is liberated. This is the heart of the Buddha's vision, not annihilation, but liberation. Not a soul, just consciousness. Not a self, just a path. Not control, just clarity. Not fear, just freedom.